So for today's class, we're going to cover some introductory material from Chapter 1. First, how do we define psychology? Psychology is the scientific study of human behavior and mental processes. So essentially, when we talk about psychology, we're talking about that study, that understanding of two parts, our mind and our behavior. And specifically, when we talk about psychology, we might be thinking about someone's thought patterns and how that might inform their behavior, or their emotions and how that might impact behavior, or some other things like our environment, our parents, our sociocultural background, and how those things might impact our behavior. But the important thing to remember here is that psychology is a science. And so the way in which we conduct research to help us better understand these mental processes and behavior will be one component that we'll cover in this particular lecture. We will also go and talk about some of the early perspectives in psychology, specifically how the field began and gotten to its current state at this point. Who are psychologists? Psychologists can do many things, but many of them are researchers, others teach, and then others use applied methods to use the baseline information that we have in the field and apply that in their current work setting. So from a research perspective, we gather data and we analyze that data in a way that we could then better understand some of the things that are happening with human behavior. From an educational perspective, many psychologists might work at an academic institution such as San Jose State University, where they are not only engaging in research but also teaching in a classroom environment. And lastly, that application piece. So when we talk about providing therapy, that's an application. When we talk about psychologists working in a work setting, for example, in an HR department and helping a company figure out how to get the best employees, and not only how to get those employees to come to their organization, but also how to keep those employees satisfied once they're there. That's an example of IO psychologist, industrial organizational psychology. These are just two applied fields, but we also have school psychology, where psychologists work in a school environment and conduct assessments to help children that might need additional learning support as they move through their education. So there are many ways in which psychology might be used from an applied perspective, in addition to our traditional forms, which are research and teaching. Psychologists work in a variety of settings. This particular graph identifies psychologists based on their first year of work outside of graduate school, so after completing their PhD programs. And we see that over a third of people that enter the field as psychologists end up in our universities, colleges, and medical schools. Now, most of those people might be teaching, but they might also be working in other ways for those universities, colleges, and medical schools. Our next largest pool is the hospitals and HMOs. So these are managed healthcare programs. So the Kaisers and Children's Hospital, etc. And again, psychologists might be working in human resources in terms of making sure that the employees are satisfied at the hospital, or they might be providing direct services by being a psychologist in the mental health ward of that hospital. We also have some other varieties of ways in which we might work as psychologists. So we can work independently for ourselves by opening our own office. That could be for a clinical reason, or it could be for consulting purposes. Many of us will work in government, so public government, U.S. government, state government, etc. Other school settings, other counseling settings, and business and consulting is a big part of our job as well, where companies essentially hire us for a brief period of time to consult on different projects that they might be working on. So you see here briefly that psychologists do have a wide range of places where you might find us in the workplace. Now let's talk about some of the early perspectives around mind and behavior. We'll start by talking about some of the philosophers. So people like Plato and Rene Descartes. they really wanted to explore the mind and understand the mind from the perspective of, is the mind this thing that actually exists within the body? Or are the mind and body separate? And so these early philosophers focused on trying to understand the mind and explain the mind as a component, maybe that it's something up in the sky that all of us have, or is it truly inside our body, an internal process? And as the field of medicine grew, the field of psychiatry became available to us. So psychiatry was established in 1808. And this particular medical field is focused particularly on studying mind and neurological imbalances. And so psychiatry has heavily influenced how we've gotten to the field of psychology. Phrenology was a specific idea and perspective that was very popular in the 1830s. And on the right side of the slide here, you see a picture of a colorful kind of description map of someone's head drawn out. The idea with phrenology was that you could actually touch the skull and get different shape, and based on the shape of the head, different parts of the head, those things were responsible. Like one side of your head would be responsible for the way you saw yourself, and another side of your head would be responsible for your understanding of right and wrong. These are just some examples. Now, while phrenology, for the most part, was found to be incorrect in terms of how it mapped out the head in this way, it did later inform our practice of getting more information about the brain and certain parts of the brain, certain areas of the brain that might impact certain types of behaviors. For example, when we talk about the different components of the brain, we'll talk about this area being really primarily focused on our thinking and analytical process. This area back here, focusing on our ability to move. The area in the back is primarily, the function is primarily to help us see. And then here in the middle, and we'll talk about these different pieces of the brain, it's more of a relay station where a lot of different processes are sent to other parts of the brain and then ultimately informs our body. We'll cover that in chapter 2. But how did psychology actually come to be? So we have someone named William Wundt, who was a German psychologist, and he's actually the first person that called himself a psychologist. He established the first laboratory for psychology in 1879 in Germany, and his particular science at that time was what he called objective introspection. So the ability for us to see inside the mind by communicating with other people. Ultimately, this science became or evolved into what's called structuralism. Edward Tishner was one of William Wundt's students, and Edward Tishner actually helped to facilitate the movement of psychology in the United States. But once structuralism, which really focused on understanding the structure of the mind, once structuralism didn't feel like the thing that was truly answering the question around the mind, we moved into this period of time called functionalism, where William James, who is really called the father of psychology, essentially developed his idea around, let's understand how the mind actually functions, and that will help us understand human behavior. So ultimately, functionalism is one of the key points that we've kind of kept in the field of psychology, but it's evolved into other sub areas. Let's talk about psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis was another early area of psychology. Dr. Sigmund Freud was the creator, if you will, of psychoanalysis, but he was largely influenced by another person named Joseph Breuer, who was a psychiatrist who believed that people needed to talk things out, and this was a way in which they could heal themselves from their mental health problems. And so Dr. Sigmund Freud used that work from Joseph Breuer to ultimately develop what we call psychoanalysis. In psychoanalysis, one of the things that these analysts really focus on is what we call the unconscious process. So there was this idea that most of our mental process was unconscious. It was something that we couldn't see or feel or touch, or we didn't know about from a conscious level, meaning we weren't fully aware of it. But those things that were buried in our unconscious were controlling our behavior, or impacting the way that we showed up in the world. And so, as a psychoanalyst, we would have a patient come, similar to this picture here, lay on the couch and talk through whatever is coming to their mind. And psychoanalysts still exist now. Psychoanalysis as a field has really morphed into what we call psychodynamic work, which we'll cover later in the semester. But right now, just for the purposes of understanding these historical perspectives, psychoanalysis really focused on unconscious processes. There was also some stuff around sex, aggression, and how people manage anxiety, but we'll cover that more in class. Behaviorism is another early perspective, and behaviorists traditionally focus on behavior as being learned. So, behavior as a learned process. And we have classical conditioning and operant conditioning. We'll talk about both of these particular areas in chapter 4, our learning chapter of the textbook. But the short of it is that behaviorists really focus on our external environment and how the people that we are around might help us understand behavior. So, for example, if I am crying, a behaviorist might say that I learned crying because I saw someone else cry. If I am angry or aggressive with someone, behaviorists would say, I learned that anger, or maybe I'm modeling that anger based on how my parents showed anger. And so therefore I saw them demonstrate anger, and now I'm basically doing that same thing. So they attribute our behavior as an external piece based on something that we've learned. Humanistic theorists is another area that really evolved, and this theory came out as a criticism largely to psychodynamic or psychoanalytic theory, in that they felt like we shouldn't focus on people's deficiencies. We shouldn't focus on the parts of them that they don't know are there. So they didn't even believe in this idea of the unconscious. Humanistic theory really focuses on how we treat each other person to person. And if we provide empathy, respect, compassion toward each other, this will actually allow us to grow. So we can reach our full human potential by the way that we interact, by our openness and willingness to be kind toward each other. And from a therapeutic perspective, we might use what's called client-centered or person-centered therapy, which was a therapy developed by Carl Rogers, who's a very famous humanist. We also will cover later in the semester Maslow's hierarchy of need. Abraham Maslow, you'll see a small picture here on the left with the triangle, and his idea was that we needed these basic physiological needs to be met before we could grow up the pyramid and essentially reach our full potential. So when we talk about humanistic theory, the idea here is really strongly based in how we grow as humans, how we become our best selves, how we reach our fullest potential. Gestalt psychology was another major area of psychology early on. Gestalt psychology primarily is used to help us understand perception. Perception is a study of how we really perceive the world, right? How we make sense of the world around us. And Gestalt comes from a word that means whole. And from this perspective, Gestalt psychology essentially is that when we look at things as a whole, it makes more sense than when we look at them as small parts. So I'll give an example here. The first image you see, if you see the black as the figure and the white as the background, then you will see a vase. But if you use the white space as the figure and the black as the background, you will see two people facing from the side view from their profile, looking at each other. This is one Gestalt principle, the principle of figure ground. On the right, you will probably see a panda or some kind of bear. And the reason that you'll see this is because even though the lines aren't fully connecting the bear at each point, again, each line together makes more sense than when we look at them as each individual squiggly lines. Those individual squiggly lines don't mean anything, but when we look at it all together, we say there's a bear, and that to us is meaningful. That is the Gestalt principle of closure, where our minds will naturally enclose lines that are not even fully enclosed. So that will break us, we'll take a pause here for this particular area of chapter 1. I'll post up some other short videos to cover the rest of this material.